Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about a drama film called 99 Homes from 2014. Enjoy your viewing. Rick has been involved in real estate for a year. He takes away people's homes by court order, and he does it almost immediately after the court order is issued. In addition, Rick is involved in other real estate frauds to make as much profit as possible. When he arrived at another debtor's house, the man pulled out a gun and killed himself. The man was survived by his wife and children, but neither the deceased nor his family cared about Rick. He needed to vacate the house as soon as possible, and that's exactly what he did. The friendly neighbor Dennis works as a construction worker. He's good at a lot of things and does a good job. But during his next project, he finds out that he won't be paid. 2 weeks of work have been wasted. The customer was not granted a loan to build a house, and the project had to be curtailed. 2 weeks were wasted. At the same time, Dennis has his own loan to pay off. He had mortgaged his house, and if he was late, it would be repossessed. When he started to have financial difficulties, Dennis went to the bank and was deliberately given very bad advice. He didn't have spider sense, so he couldn't recognize the deception. As a result, on the advice of the bankers, he did not pay for several months, and the bank lawyers, who were satisfied, went to court. Dennis came to the court hearing with his son Connor. He tried to explain to the judge how dear this house was to him, and that he was ready to start making payments on the loan again, if only he could stay there. But the judge was adamant. He considers many similar cases a day, and each one has its own excuses. Even an appeal to conscience did not help. After all, he was looking at a boy who could end up on the street. They were given 30 days to file an appeal, otherwise they would be evicted. Dennis lived with his mother, whose name was Lynn. After telling her what had happened, he started calling lawyers who could help him for free or for a minimal fee, but he could not find a good lawyer. His job situation was no better. Things got really bad when, the day after the trial, Rick came to his house with some police officers he knew. They were helping him evict the debtors. Dennis tried to explain to him that he still had a month, but Rick was not interested. He had a document saying that the house now belonged to the bank. Dennis was given 2 minutes to gather his personal belongings. Rick's people took everything else outside, in front of the house. At that moment, Connor returned from school. He was shocked by what was happening. Dennis had to take his mother and son to a cheap motel where people like him lived. But Dennis was not going to stay here for long. He would find a job and give them their home back. But that was exactly where the problem arose. They didn't want to hire Dennis. When he returned to the motel, he discovered that an expensive tool he had bought for repairs was missing. Dennis realized that one of Rick's employees had stolen the tool. He went to the realtor's office to investigate and almost got into a fight. At that moment, Rick showed up. He was in urgent need of people, and he offered Dennis a quick $50 job. He agreed. When they arrived at the site, it became clear that $50 would not be enough. The owners of the house where they arrived knew that they would soon lose their home, so they had broken down the sewage system. Now all the rooms were filled with garbage. Rick's people refused to clean it up. Dennis stepped up to the plate. For $250, he agreed to clean it all up. Rick promised to pay, and he did. Returning to his family with the money, Dennis comforted his son and mother. Shortly afterward, Rick invited Dennis to his home to fix some wiring problems. He did a quick job, and Rick realized he might need this guy. He offered Dennis to work for him. Rick was willing to pay well, but there would be a lot of work. As they were driving through a residential neighborhood, Rick noticed one of the debtors stealing water and electricity from a neighboring house that had already been evicted. He asked the man to stop. Dennis knew the man. Their children were friends. Moreover, Frank was in court the day Dennis lost his house. He himself could soon be homeless. Dennis did not start working for Rick on a full-time basis. At first, he simply removed air conditioners from seized homes and pool pumps. To do this, he invited a friend to help him. Without such equipment, it would be harder for the bank to sell the house. This is what Rick used to make money. He got his share, and Dennis got his. He also went to the homeowners to inform them that they were about to be evicted. He offered the services of Rick's company, but they mostly did not listen to him. Although there were some who agreed to cooperate, Dennis was not happy with the job. He himself had recently lost his home, so he understood the people he was notifying of eviction. But he needed the money to get his own home back, so he had to step over himself and do what he was paid to do. Finally, Dennis saved enough to try to pay the house back. When he told Rick, he offered to buy the house and sell it to Dennis in installments. Dennis agreed. However, they would not be able to return home for another couple of weeks. In order to pay Rick off, Dennis would have to evict the debtors himself. Rick offered Dennis a gun for self-defense, because sometimes you have to deal with very aggressive landlords. But Dennis refused. He was sure he could handle it without a gun. When he arrived at his first client for an eviction, he was met by the same cops who had kicked Dennis's family out of their home. Together, they started evicting another debtor. He, his wife, and children were thrown out on the street. Dennis felt terrible and tried to make the situation better, but he was not very good at it. Returning to his home improved the situation a bit. Dennis grew up here, and his son was born here, and he couldn't part with this place. When he brought Connor and Lynn here, they were surprised that the house belonged to them again. When they learned that Rick had helped Dennis, Lynn was upset. She wanted nothing to do with this man. Meanwhile, Dennis continued to evict people for debt. He met different characters. Some of them were renting a house and heard about the threat of eviction for the first time. Others were too old to understand the situation. One old man simply did not know where to go, because he had no family or friends in the city. The police decided to hand him over to the Red Cross, and they would determine where the old man would go next. With each new eviction, Dennis felt worse and worse. He had already been attacked, and one of the debtors met him with a gun. Dennis asked Rick for a gun. He was always armed because he had been tried more than once to settle scores. He received threatening phone calls all the time, but he didn't pay attention. His father was an ordinary construction worker. He died at work, and the family did not receive any insurance compensation. Rick fought his way up from the bottom and wasn't going to stop until he reached the top. And the top was already looming on the horizon. There was a prospect of earning a lot of money. All he had to do was evict 100 debtors, and then Rick would get a contract for 1,000 houses. From this deal, Dennis would have at least $200,000. Rick advised him to forget about the old house and buy a new one. That way he would not only make a good investment, but also start living a rich life. One day, while driving by Frank's house, Dennis stopped by to give him advice about the upcoming trial. He was sure that the judge would rule in favor of the bank and advised him to prepare for it in advance. But Frank didn't want to talk to Dennis. He despised him for working with Rick. The two of them had pulled off a lot of illegal scams. Over time, it no longer seemed shameful to Dennis. He was just making money for his family. However, they had to live in a motel. When they were celebrating Connor's birthday, a new resident arrived. He recognized Dennis and began to blame him for his own eviction. Dennis tried to defend himself and said that it wasn't him, but the man remembered him. He told all the neighbors that Rick's partner lived next door to them. Dennis began to receive threats. Realizing that his loved ones were in danger, Dennis advised them to lock themselves in until he could find a safe place for them to live. In the meantime, he and Rick received a large contract thanks to their fraud and celebrated. Drunk, Dennis admitted that he was grateful to Rick for the opportunity to make money. He just didn't know what to do when he lost everything. In Dennis's opinion, Rick saved him. After receiving the money, Dennis bought a mansion and brought his family there. Lynn immediately suspected that the property was purchased with money earned by evicting people. She did not want to live there. When she found out that Dennis had sold their old house, she was furious. Lynn thought it was better to move in with relatives in another city than to stay here. Connor sided with her. He didn't like what his father was doing. Soon, Rick started having problems. It turned out that Frank could keep his house, and this could cause a chain reaction, and they would lose a lucrative contract. To prevent this from happening, Rick printed a fake document, dated retroactively, and ordered Dennis to take it to court. If the judge saw the file, he would have Frank's home evicted. Dennis arrived at the courthouse, but for a long time he did not dare to hand over the document. Finally, Rick's friend found him and took the envelope himself. As a result, Frank's family lost their roof over their heads. When Dennis returned to the mansion after the trial, he realized that Lynn and Connor had left. He was left alone. Dennis got drunk out of grief, and in the morning Rick woke him up because he had to go evict Frank. The neighbors had already gathered outside the house. Some cops they knew came to help with the eviction. They talked to a neighbor and found out that Frank was a hunter and might have a gun at home. As luck would have it, Dennis had left his gun at home. When they tried to evict Frank, he broke a window and threatened the police. He was convinced that he had been convicted illegally. People could have gotten hurt, so Dennis came forward and admitted that he had indeed delivered a fake document to the court. He said this because he could not do otherwise. His conscience did not allow it. Realizing that he was telling the truth, Frank laid down his weapon and surrendered to the police. Dennis was also taken to the police car and put in the back seat. Rick was also suspected of fraud. Dennis sat in the car and watched as the authorities talked to his boss. If you have watched the video so far, you should know that I am happy to have viewers like you. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel and follow the news. Klonsak Recapped was with you. See you soon.